He confessed to the murder before the investigators fully understood what had happened. The statement was recorded. The confession was clear. There were no screams, no visible threats, no physical force. On paper, it looked perfect. A suspect, a motive, a confession, a closed case. That is how most criminal investigations are supposed to end. But this one didn't. This one had already gone wrong, even though no one in the room realized it yet. The interrogation room was small and windowless. Plain walls, a metal table, two cameras mounted in opposite corners. Red recording lights were on. The man sitting at the table did not look dangerous. He did not look angry. He looked exhausted. His name was Jack Miller, 31 years old, no criminal record, no history of violence, no signs of panic. He sat still, hands folded, eyes unfocused, as if he had already accepted whatever was about to happen to him. The detective across the table asked simple questions. Name, date of birth, relationship to the victim. Jack answered quietly. He did not argue, he did not resist. That alone raised no alarms. Some suspects cooperate, some don't. This one did, almost too easily. After several hours, the questions changed. They became slower, repetitive, carefully worded. The same details asked again and again. Timelines, emotions, motives. Jack's voice grew weaker with each answer. His posture collapsed slightly. His breathing became shallow. He stopped making eye contact. These were not signs of guilt. They were signs of fatigue. Then came the moment that would define everything. The detective leaned forward and asked a final question. Not aggressively. Calmly, almost gently. Jack, did you kill her? There was a long pause. No background noise, no movement. Just the hum of the lights and the quiet recording of the cameras. Jack swallowed. His hands trembled slightly, and then he spoke. Yes. One word, clear, unambiguous. The room changed instantly. The detectives exchanged brief looks. Pens moved faster. Notes were written. This was what they needed, a confession, on record, from the primary suspect. Jack continued speaking. He described an argument. He described fear. He described a moment he claimed he could not control. His voice cracked. Tears formed. He apologized. He took responsibility. Everything sounded right. Too right. The confession was signed. The recording saved. The timeline, as they understood it, made sense. The investigation shifted direction immediately, from searching for a killer to preparing a prosecution. What no one noticed that night was a detail so small it seemed irrelevant. A number, a timestamp, a gap that would later tear the entire case apart. Because while Jack was confessing to a murder, the evidence was already telling a different story. And the real crime had only just begun. Before she became a case file, she was a person. Her name was Emily Carter, 23 years old, graduate student. No criminal history, no known enemies, no record of violence, addiction, or risky behavior. To investigators, that made the case more disturbing, not less. Crimes like this usually leave patterns. Emily's life did not. She lived alone in a small apartment on the third floor of an older residential building. Quiet neighborhood. No recent break-ins reported. No complaints from neighbors. According to friends and family, Emily followed routines. She studied during the day, worked part-time in the evenings, and usually returned home before 10. She didn't host parties. She didn't bring strangers home. Her phone records showed nothing unusual in the days leading up to her death. The night she died, there were no signs of forced entry. The front door was locked from the inside. The windows were closed. Nothing appeared broken or disturbed. Her purse was still in the apartment. Her phone was found charging on the kitchen counter. Her keys were on the table. Whoever entered that apartment did not break in. Whoever killed her was either invited inside or already there. Emily's body was discovered the next morning by her coworker, who became concerned when she didn't show up for a scheduled shift. Police arrived shortly after. The scene was clean, too clean. There was no evidence of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no defensive wounds, just a single blunt force injury to the back of the head and clear signs of manual strangulation. The medical examiner would later confirm that she was alive when the strangulation began. Conscious. A detail that changed how investigators viewed the crime. The estimated time of death was placed between 10 and 11 p.m. This was based on body temperature, lividity, and stomach contents. It was not an exact science, but it was precise enough to narrow the window. That window would become critical later. At the time, however, it seemed to fit neatly with the story police were beginning to construct. Attention quickly turned to her personal relationships. Family members were ruled out. Friends were interviewed and cleared. That left one person who stood out immediately: her former boyfriend, Jack Miller. Emily and Jack had dated for just over a year. They met in college. Friends described the relationship as mostly normal. Occasional arguments, nothing violent. 2 months before her death, Emily ended the relationship. Text messages recovered from her phone showed no threats, no harassment, no explicit anger. Just unresolved emotions and a lack of closure. That alone was enough for investigators to label Jack as emotionally unstable. In homicide investigations, emotional proximity often outweighs physical evidence. According to phone records, Jack and Emily exchanged messages the day she died. Nothing alarming, no plans to meet, no argument. Still, Jack admitted he had gone to her building that evening, claiming he wanted to talk. He said she refused to let him in. That detail immediately raised suspicion. Why go there at all? Why show up uninvited? Investigators believed they already had their motive. By the end of the first day, the narrative was set. A breakup, lingering emotions, a confrontation that escalated, a moment of loss of control. It was a story prosecutors had told juries countless times. And now, with a confession on record, it seemed complete. But narratives are not evidence, and early assumptions have a way of blinding investigators to facts that don't fit. At the scene of Emily's death, there was something missing. No fingerprints, no DNA that didn't belong to her, no trace evidence connecting Jack to the apartment that night. These gaps were dismissed as unfortunate but not unusual. What no one questioned was the most dangerous assumption of all: that Emily died at the hands of someone she knew. And that assumption would delay the truth for years. By the time Jack Miller was officially labeled a suspect, the decision had already been made. Not on paper, but in the minds of the investigators. The evidence did not lead them to Jack. The story did. A former boyfriend, emotional attachment, recent contact. In homicide investigations, this combination is often enough to narrow vision and accelerate conclusions. Jack was brought in under the pretense of routine questioning. He was not read his rights immediately. He was told he was not under arrest. He was told the interview would be brief. None of those statements turned out to be true. The moment he sat down, the room controlled everything: the lighting, the time, the pace, and the pressure. For the first several hours, the questions were calm and procedural. Where were you yesterday? What time did you leave work? Did you speak to Emily? Jack answered consistently. He admitted going to her building. He admitted wanting to talk. He admitted she did not let him in. At that stage, nothing he said contradicted the known evidence, but consistency does not help a suspect once investigators stop listening. As the hours passed, the tone shifted. The questions became circular. Timelines were challenged. Minor discrepancies were framed as lies. Investigators suggested they already knew what happened. They implied that evidence existed even when it didn't. Jack was told that cooperating would help him, that honesty would make a difference. These statements were legal, common, and deeply misleading. Jack began to doubt himself. He asked for the time. He was told they were almost done. He asked for water. It came late. He asked if he needed a lawyer. He was told that was his choice. No one told him how dangerous that choice was. Fatigue is not dramatic. It does not arrive suddenly. It erodes. Jack's posture changed. His speech slowed. His confidence collapsed. When investigators repeated their version of events often enough, Jack began to picture it. Not because it was true, but because exhaustion makes suggestion feel like memory. They told him Emily was dead. Then they told him she suffered. Then they told him there was no other explanation. Each statement pushed him closer to a single conclusion, that resisting was pointless. The final stage was subtle. There were no raised voices, no threats, just silence. Long pauses. The implication that the only way forward was agreement. When the detective finally asked, "Did you kill her?" It did not feel like a question. It felt like a requirement. Jack said yes. Not because he remembered doing it, but because after 11 hours saying no felt impossible. What investigators recorded as a confession was, in reality, a psychological surrender. Jack repeated details that were fed to him. He accepted responsibility for actions he could not explain. He apologized for a crime he did not understand. And in that moment, the case shifted from investigation to confirmation. From that point on, every piece of information was interpreted through the lens of Jack's guilt. Contradictions were minimized. Missing evidence was rationalized. Alternative suspects were ignored. The system moved forward, confident it had done its job. But confessions, especially exhausted ones, are not truth. They are compliance. And the truth had already started to push back. The confession did not happen in a single moment. It was built slowly, piece by piece, over the course of hours. By the time Jack Miller said the words out loud, the decision had already been made for him. His body was present in the room, but his resistance was gone. The recording shows a man who looks calm. That is the most misleading part. His voice is steady. His answers are short. There is no visible panic. To an untrained eye, this appears voluntary. In reality, it is the sound of someone who has reached emotional shutdown. Fatigue has replaced fear. Compliance has replaced clarity. The detective begins by summarizing the story for him. Not asking, telling. He describes an argument. He describes raised voices. He describes anger turning physical. Jack is asked only to confirm. Each time he hesitates, the silence stretches. The pressure increases without a single aggressive word being spoken. Jack starts to repeat phrases he did not originate. He nods when details are suggested. He corrects nothing. He fills gaps with uncertainty rather than denial. At this stage, the confession is no longer about truth. It is about ending the process. When Jack finally says, "I killed her," it is not accompanied by emotion. There is no outburst, no breakdown, just resignation. He looks down at his hands. His fingers tremble slightly. The detective does not react. He simply continues, guiding Jack through the rest of the narrative. Jack describes pushing Emily. He describes fear. He describes not knowing what to do. These descriptions align perfectly with the theory investigators have already accepted. They do not challenge inconsistencies. They do not ask for clarification. The goal is not understanding, it is documentation. The confession is written. Jack is asked to read it. He struggles to focus. He asks for a break. The request is delayed. He signs anyway. The signature is uneven. The ink smears slightly. It becomes the most powerful piece of evidence in the case. From that moment on, everything changes. Investigators stop searching for what happened and begin preparing to prove what they believe happened. The confession becomes the anchor. Every timeline is adjusted to fit it. Every missing piece is explained around it. What the confession does not include is just as important as what it does. There is no mention of how Jack entered the apartment, no explanation for the locked door, no physical evidence supporting the account. These gaps are ignored. Confessions create confidence. Confidence creates blindness. The recording ends. The red light turns off. The detectives leave the room. Jack remains seated for several minutes alone. He stares at the table. He does not cry. He does not speak. He has done what was required of him. Outside that room, the case is already being described as solved. But confessions do not change facts. They only change focus. And the facts were about to destroy everything. The case did not collapse all at once. It fractured quietly along a line no one expected to matter. While prosecutors prepared charges and investigators moved on, one detail refused to align with the confession. Not a dramatic revelation, just a number, a timestamp. Weeks after the arrest, the medical examiner finalized the autopsy report. Cause of death was confirmed. Manner of death remained homicide, but the time of death was refined. Based on core body temperature, lividity patterns, and gastric contents, Emily Carter's death was placed between 10 and 11 p.m. This narrowed window was not speculation. It was science, and it created a problem no one could ignore. According to Jack's own statement, he had left the area shortly before 8. At the time, this discrepancy was dismissed as confusion, exhaustion, faulty memory. Investigators assumed the confession was correct and the timing could be adjusted. That assumption would prove fatal to the case. A junior defense investigator was the first to question it. While reviewing routine surveillance footage from a nearby convenience store, he noticed Jack on camera at 7:43 p.m. The image was clear. Date and time embedded. Jack was alone, calm, buying a bottle of water. The store was over 15 minutes away from Emily's apartment on foot. The footage was verified, then verified again. There was no indication it had been altered. Combined with phone location data, it established Jack's movements with uncomfortable precision. By 8 p.m., he was nowhere near Emily's building. The prosecution attempted to reframe the timeline. They argued the medical estimate could be wrong. They suggested Emily may have died earlier than initially believed. But the physical evidence did not support that theory. The body showed no signs consistent with an earlier death. No decomposition anomalies, no contradiction. The contradiction was undeniable. If Emily died after 10, Jack could not have killed her. Once that conclusion was reached, everything else unraveled. The confession was re-examined, the interrogation reviewed, the absence of physical evidence reclassified from unfortunate to critical. The locked door problem resurfaced. No explanation fit the confession anymore. In court, the surveillance footage was played in silence. No commentary, no argument. Just the image of a man who was supposedly committing murder, calmly buying water miles away. The judge did not hesitate. The confession was ruled unreliable. The charges were dismissed. Jack Miller was released. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of error, just paperwork and silence. The case was not reopened. It was labeled inactive. Investigators cited insufficient evidence. Leads were not pursued. Potential suspects were never identified. The system chose closure over correction. Jack walked free but not cleared. His name remained tied to the crime. His life did not return to normal. But the greater consequence was elsewhere. The real killer had watched the system fail and learned that it could. 6 years passed without an arrest. The case of Emily Carter remained inactive, buried under administrative codes and unanswered questions. For the public, it was forgotten. For Jack Miller, it never ended. And for the person who actually killed Emily, it was proof that the system could be defeated. The case resurfaced by accident. In a different city, hundreds of miles away, police responded to another quiet apartment building. Another woman. Similar age. Similar living situation. No signs of forced entry. Door locked from the inside. Minimal disturbance. Blunt force trauma followed by manual strangulation. The parallels were impossible to ignore. This time, investigators moved slower. A detective reviewing the new case requested access to unresolved homicides with similar characteristics. Emily Carter's file appeared near the top of the list. As he read through it, something felt familiar. Not the suspect, not the confession, the structure of the crime itself. He requested the original evidence, not the conclusions. The raw footage. Hours of video were reviewed again. Surveillance cameras dismissed years earlier. Hallway angles, parking lot feeds, elevator recordings labeled unusable. This time, the review was frame by frame. In one elevator video, barely noticeable at first, a reflection appeared. Polished metal, distorted light, a human shape. Not Jack. Not any documented visitor. A man standing just outside the frame, visible only for less than a second. He was wearing gloves, his face never appeared, but his presence was undeniable. That footage had always been there. It had simply been ignored. Further analysis connected the image to the second crime scene. Same build, same posture, same entry pattern. This time, there was DNA. Partial, degraded. But enough. The killer had made a mistake. The suspect was identified quietly, arrested without announcement, charged without spectacle. The evidence was overwhelming. The confession that finally mattered did not come easily. During questioning, the man admitted to watching the earlier investigation closely. He knew about Jack. He knew about the confession. He knew the police had stopped looking. He chose his second victim because he believed he was invisible. Emily Carter's case was reopened. Officially. Publicly. The confession that once ended the investigation was now cited as a failure. Jack Miller was formally cleared. Too late to undo the damage. Too late to give him back the years he lost. The final report concluded with a sentence rarely written so plainly. The investigation prematurely focused on a confession and failed to follow the evidence. Emily did not die because her killer was smarter than the system. She died because the system stopped asking questions. And sometimes the most dangerous thing in a murder investigation is believing the case is already solved.